What was the turning point of the American Revolution?
Well, that's a good question, but it's also a really hard question. And I think the easiest answer would be to say Yorktown, when there's this decisive victory of the French and the Americans over the British. And that pretty much ends the war, but it goes on in a sputtering way for some time. But I think that's just one of the turning points. I mean, I think it's really hard to pick one turning point. I would say one of the turning points is when Washington crosses the Delaware and he surprises the British at Trenton and then at Princeton. And that gives a tremendous shot in the arm to American hopes and sort of gets the idea to a lot of Americans' head that they could maybe win this.
The Battle of Trenton was a turning point in the Revolution because it blunted Britain's great attempt to suppress the American rebellion. Britain had sent a tremendous armada to America with a large part of its standing army in an effort to crush the rebellion. It had taken New York City, it had driven Washington's army out of New York all the way across New Jersey. It had, Continental Army was in disintegration. Washington turned at Christmas of 1776, attacked the Hessian garrison at Trenton, and turned that campaign around. The British were forced to evacuate New Jersey, and all they had to show for this massive campaign that they'd engaged in was possession of New York City. And ultimately, possession of American cities wouldn't crush that revolution.
I think most scholars would say that the successful crossing of the Delaware was the military turning point of the war. Washington was right on the edge of the cliff and about to fall over. And if he had not succeeded at crossing the Delaware and surprising the Hessians and winning that victory and then moving on to Trenton and Princeton and others, I think the war would have been over. I think a lot of the soldiers would have gone home and that would have been it.
Then I think another important turning point is when they're at Valley Forge, at a real nadir. And the troops are cold, have very little provisions, and things are really looking bad. They've just suffered some defeats. And they learn about the treaty with France, and they realize all of a sudden they have a tremendous European ally and a foe of the British, and that gives a new impetus. So I think the war went on for a long time. I think there were a whole series of events, highs and lows. So I don't think you can say that there's any real turning point. There are a bunch of points that, indicate victory and the final victory at Yorktown.
If you say what was the turning point of the revolution, I think that's a different answer. There have been plenty of revolutionary wars which have come to a successful conclusion, and that is that the people revolting won the last battle, won the war. But in reality, the one who is leading the military forces puts himself into the same position of the king or the dictator who's been overturned. The real turning point of the revolution was when Washington refuses to let his men make him king. And he resigns his commission from the military and puts the government in the hands of the people, in the hands of the civilian leaders. That's when we have the real completed successful revolution.
The American Revolution didn't end at Yorktown. There's a long twilight period where Washington and his army watch carefully the British garrison in New York, waiting for the British to renew the war while peace negotiations are going on. And it's during that time that the army is discontented. The officers of the American army were severely discontented. They hadn't been paid for an awfully long time. And some officers wanted to use the army to take control of the government, something that's happened time and again. It had taken place before in other revolutions and would take place revolutions subsequent to ours. Washington refused to do that, and he managed to convince his officers that that would betray the most fundamental principles of the American Revolution. They formed an organization at the end of this period, in the summer of 1783, called the Society of the Cincinnati, which pledged all of them mutually to uphold the civilian control of the army, which is a fundamental principle of the American Republic, one that we get to take for granted, but that would not have been taken for granted in the 18th century.
What do you consider George Washington's greatest leadership trait?
I don't think you'll ever meet a man who was more determined than George Washington. He may not have been the most talented general or the best person in terms of tactics or strategy, but when it came to determination, there's Washington and then there's everybody else. And Washington really believed that he was going to win this war, or he was going to die trying. And I think that's consistent throughout the war from the beginning to the end. I think that rubbed off on all of his generals and all of his soldiers. And that determination was really America's secret weapon during the war.
Washington treated everyone with courtesy and respect. And that courtesy and respect was returned and engendered loyalty in those around him. Washington was determined, and that might be said to be one of Washington's greatest traits, but even tyrants can be determined. A great leader is someone who can engender determination in others, and in Washington's case, in a whole army. And you can only do that by engendering respect in those that you lead. Washington was respected by his men, but it was because he respected them.
He also was a great, what we call today, a role model. I mean, in his, sort of moral probity, in his decorum, in his courage, in his leadership, his really good, he was a good politician. His dignity, his reticence, his patriotism, all those things do really make him one of the greatest men in the world.
Did Washington's experiences with his generals make him a better president?
Well, definitely, I think the war in general made him a better president because he had to deal with so much stress and so much conflict, and most of all, he had to deal with Congress. And if you think they're a mess now, boy, back then they were really a mess. He couldn't get them to answer letters. He couldn't get them to send money. And I think when he became president, he remembered a lot of this. So he was very cagey, and he was very adept at dealing with the men in Congress.
Washington's experience as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army was absolutely vital in shaping his administrative ability and his ability as a leader of a collective group. How Washington handles his cabinet as President of the United States is very similar to the way he handled his commanders in councils of war during the Revolution. Because that changed over the course of the Revolution. In the early stages of the Revolution, Washington held councils of war and took votes on strategy and tactics, and sometimes even followed the votes, even if they didn't agree with what his own views about strategy and tactics ought to be. As he matured as a leader, he learned to use his councils of war not so much as democratic forums to decide on strategy and tactics, but to build consensus among his general officers for policies that he wanted to follow. And as president, he used precisely that same approach in dealing with an often fractious cabinet. And Washington, as president, gathered around himself some of the most brilliant minds of the American 18th century, but they didn't always agree with one another. And only somebody with Washington's skill at building consensus among often opposing people could have held a cabinet that held the likes of Jefferson and Hamilton together and keep them in harness together. And it's a phrase Washington often used, keeping people in harness together as a team.
Leading by example and by his diplomatic skills and his own personal integrity and modeling, sort of role model, I think allowed him to be a great general and then a great president and put the stamp on the presidency. That's the other thing, that when he was in the presidency, he was very conscious that he was inventing the presidency. And he always did that with a lot of reticence, I think, and a lot of humility. And he's just the best model for a president that I can imagine. And you know, we feel that every day in his contributions to this country. You know, not only to winning the war, but to being the sort of one of the driving forces around the Constitution and then the presidency. So, you know, he's with us very much today. That's why Americans, and especially our young people, should know a lot about him.